Hello everyone, welcome back to another Stratagoy video. Welcome to 2025 in Stratagoy land, I guess we could say. Sorry the videos have kind of fallen off. I had every intention of making some more videos while I was back in the States for the holidays, but then on Christmas Day I ended up getting sick with a pretty nasty sinus infection, and it's kind of taken me out of the game for a while here. So anyway, let's jump back into things. I hope you guys are having a good start to the new year and are enjoying the new points changes and rules changes. I've only gotten 2 games in, unfortunately, since all that changed because the rules came out a day before I went home for the States, and then I don't have any of my stuff there, and then came back and was pretty out of it. So anyway, just kind of getting back into the swing of things, but OBR, I've still got a pretty good feel for, and I even got a game in the other day with an elite kind of Catacross and then all Morghast list plus a Bone Soul Mason. So anyway, yeah, let's just pick up where we left off in the series. Obviously, we started off with the index itself, the index review with Jonas and myself. And then I ended up getting around to part 1, which I'll go ahead and get to this next slide here, where we focused on the quote-unquote big guys. That was the War Masters, so Nagash, Archon, and Catacross. And then the kind of 2 monstery things, one of them is actually a monster, the Gothazar Harvester, plus the Mortek Crawler, since they don't really fit in with any of this other stuff. And then I did the 3 endless spells. The big, maybe, I guess, point of contention in that one was that I had given, out of a 5-star scale, Catacross a 4 out of 5 stars, and people seem to think that he deserves to be up in 5 territory, which I could be convinced of. I'm still trying to play him myself and get to that kind of understanding of how he works in the current meta. But it might just not be my play style. I don't know. Anyway, we'll have to see. But today we're going to be focusing on the Cavalry and the Elite. I lumped in basically the 3 Kavalos units, so the 2 heroes plus Kavalos Deathriders, so our traditional Cavalry. And then also, as you see in the picture here, the 2 Morghast units, because even though they're technically infantry, they are fast and kind of fulfill a sort of cavalry role in certain kind of perspectives. And then lastly, because the infantry category was already so big with all the Mortisan heroes, plus a Tirada cohort and Immortis Guard, I decided to put the elite smaller infantry guys, the Kurnoth level guys, so Immortis Guard and Necropolis Stalkers in with the cavalry here, so that we had roughly equal sized groups for all 3 videos. Anyway, next time we'll be covering the remainder. So, just a reminder for our star rating system. This is a rough rating out of 5 stars per war scroll. Keep in mind the meta shifts, thus opinions might change. And even whenever anyone does a list like this, they're doing their best to pick stuff out and rank things to the best of their knowledge and experience. But that could even change over the course of, say, the new rules that just came out, or we're just getting more games in, or seeing what more matchups look like with different missions. All kinds of things could change. So nothing's set in stone here, but this is just my current kind of feeler for all these things right now. And then I'd love to hear what you guys think down in the comments. As far as the ratings themselves, 1 star is kind of a best to avoid, while on the other side of the spectrum we have 5 stars, which wouldn't hurt to bring in every list, that sort of unit. Then in the middle, of course, we have decent in certain situations. Just below that would be a suboptimal pick, and 4 would be a above optimal pick, if you will. So great in most situations, or above optimal. I don't know if that's the right way. We don't really have an opposite for suboptimal, but you get what I mean. The other side of the coin. And I think that's pretty obvious. It's worth saying that just because something's a 3-star, I think maybe one thing I would tweak on this is not 3-star could also be a unit that's actually great, but in very specific situations, whereas a 2-star would be probably bad in almost all situations, or it could be like a pet unit, but it wouldn't necessarily be helping you win. You just like bringing it, Okay, so let's get on with the 2 leaders we've got here. We've got I'm going to start with the generic Liege-Kavalos before I go into the named one, which is Arch-Kavalos Zandtos. So the Liege-Kavalos is 210 points for a cavalry leader that's, like I said, generic, which means, of course, he can take a heroic trait and artifact. For his battle profile options, he can take any OBR, which is one of his greatest strengths. And he's also what I call an italics hero, which means he can be taken by certain other heroes. That happens to be the 3 War Masters, unfortunately, in OBR, meaning that even though that is great that he can be taken, you're not getting away with it with like having a hero as an italics hero in another hero's regiment without taking one of your expensive heroes, and the cheapest of which is Archon at 410 points. So in a certain sense, to be able to get access to that ability, you're paying a 410 point tax if you want to see it that way. Another thing worth pointing out while I'm onto it, with the new rules that we got, we had a new season rule for what you could choose for your honor guard. And the rule is the plus 2-inch movement one, which would be really great for OBR in general, because it would help enable some Mortec guard type lists to really get up the field and do what they want to do. The problem is the wording of that rule says that it has to be an infantry hero that's also an italics hero. So a hero that's in a regiment but that isn't part of that isn't leading the regiment. And if you have that kind of hero, so like oftentimes it's like a banner bearer, but they expanded the list of things in the most recent battle scroll to update every army, not every army, but a lot of armies with extra options for these. We did get an extra one that was namely Arch-Kavalos Zandtos, but because it also says that hero has to be an infantry hero, we don't have any of those in OBR, which means we're not getting access to that trait, which is a bummer because it could have really helped sped up the Immortis Guard, Necropolis Stalkers, and Mortec Guard lists, and I suppose Tyranid Cohort, but they don't need speeding up all that much. So, that's a bummer, but it is what it is. Okay, so back to the Liege-Kavalos himself, though. I like to compare kind of the relationship between the Liege-Kavalos and Arch-Kavalos Zandtos to another pair of similar heroes for about the same amount of points that I did a video like this on, which would be the Kalian King from Idoneth and then Volturnos, the named variant. They basically both have similar profiles, and I'll point out the things that are different between them. But you're looking at a dude that hits decently with 5 attacks, 3s, -1, 2 damage, +1 damage on the charge, and does crit 2 hits, like almost all OBR things that aren't companions. 7 health, 10-inch move, 3+ save, control 2. Then you got a steed that's basically just doing, I think that's double work from a Kavalos Deathrider. I can't remember if they have 3 or 2 attacks, the steed. But I think it's 2. So it's like 2 steeds worth, but otherwise the profile is exactly the same. Also, like the Kavalos Deathriders, they've got the two charge phase kind of abilities, one of which, the first one, Spear of the Cavalry, says that if you make a charge, you can pass through infantry as if you had fly. And then kind of combined with that rule is in any charge phase, if this unit charged and it passed over some infantry unit, you can pick one of those infantry units if it passed over using that other rule, and then do on a D3 2+ that amount of mortal damage, so either 2 or 3. It's totally fine on a single hero like this. I feel like that rule, which is exactly the same on the Kavalos Deathriders, is less impressive because it doesn't scale on the basis of how many models you have. It's just once, regardless of how big the unit is. And if you're reinforcing it, you're still only getting it to go off once, which is kind of a bummer. But anyway, so the other rule that the guys got is the 1-2 punch rule that we see. And there's 2 different types of 1-2 punch rules. There's basically the type where a hero fights and then some other unit that's determined on that rule itself. So in this case, Kavalos Deathriders, if they're within combat range, so within 3 inches of him, they can immediately fight after him. Great. But the better version of the rule is when that happens and that unit gets like a +1 to hit or +1 to wound or some other buff. We are not seeing that on here, but considering how good the Kavalos Deathriders already are, we don't really need the +1 to hit or +1 to wound, I suppose. That said, you can see here that I only gave the Liege-Kavalos a 3-star rating, partly because while he's fine to take, and I think there is a place to take him, he's not like an auto take with the otherwise auto take Kavalos Deathriders in the meta right now, because he's helping them do what they want to do, but not by a whole lot. But let me make a case for why you might want to take him anyway. So in the notes, I mentioned that he's kind of a 1-2 punch with the Deathriders. That's exactly what we just talked about. He's also, one of the better reasons to take him is his solid enhancement caddy, which means if you have, you only have like the generic heroes that can take your artifacts and your heroic traits. And this army is very elite. You end up taking usually one of the War Masters, so Nagash, Katakros, or Archon, but they can't take an enhancement. And then you're looking at either this guy or the Mortisans that are not generic. So the Soul Reaper, the Soul Mason, the Bone Shaper, and the Ossiffector. But they're all slow, and that kind of gets me to, I guess I'll skip to the second to last point here. Oh, this is the Liege-Kavalos is OBR's cheapest hero that can keep up with your cavalry and or the Morghast units at 10-inch movement. The problem with those other heroes is they're pretty slow, and they're often pretty weak. This guy can actually at least fight back and maybe do some damage, and with the 1-2 punch ability, he's helping you punch through if he's going along with those other guys. His speed also means that he's better able to be a nexus for your relentless discipline points, or relentless discipline abilities, I should say, your main battle traits, giving out those 12-inch bubble abilities. If you have one of those Mortisan guys that's carrying your enhancements, they're probably staying back with your castle. Could be with some crawlers, could be with some Immortis Guard or something more defensive, some Immortis Guard, could be with Katakros. But in any case, there's a really good chance they're not going out in the field and grabbing objectives or doing anything special, and or taking some of your great artifacts and heroic traits, which want to be within often 12-inch bubble of something, and then having those actually play a role in the game unless your opponent comes to you. So the Liege-Kavalos is great as that caddy because he can kind of bring all of that value where you need it to be on the battlefield. I also mentioned, third point here, he's an Italics hero, which helps keep the drops down if you put him into the regiment of one of your other War Masters, or he can lead a regiment to take any OBR, which is a great thing because, as we're going to see with some of the units, well, Kavalos Deathriders mainly, they can't be taken by the Mortisan guys on foot. So kind of combining that with the enhancement caddy thing, that's another reason to take him, is because if he's leading his own regiment, he can be bringing Kavalos Deathriders with him. I already mentioned that fifth point, and then the last one, he's got decent defense and output at 7 health, 3 up save, 6 up ward base, but could go to 5 with the relentless discipline in combat. Now, let's take a look at his output. There's not a huge difference between these two here. Both of them, if you've never seen one of my charts before, we're going from a 6+ save down to a 2+ save, then a little pause there for the expected value average, which is just a flat average across all 5 saves there, so they're all weighted equally, which often comes out to be roughly the same as a 4-up save, but isn't mathematically always the same. So I wouldn't read too much into that. But so you can look at, a popular thing is just to look at a 4-up save, but I would also encourage you to look at the expected value average, because depending on what your rend characteristic is, that they might differ a bit. But anyway, I only calculated 2 different full charts here. Each one has a base profile given whatever assumption. So the base, the top one, is just what he is on any given day without any buffs. Then on the charge, he does more work. And then I said plus impact, which is implying the charge. That would be that he charged and moved over some infantry and then did potentially 2 or 3 mortal damage. And so that's factored in there. So we're looking at expected value average of about 6 damage when he's on the charge. And then if he flies over some infantry, getting closer to 8, maybe 7 3/4 or something. If you happen to use the Relentless Discipline ability to give him +1 to wound, then we can look at the bottom chart there, which pushes those up a bit. Then the normal on charge looks a bit more like what we just saw for the impact hits on the charge as well. And then the impact version, when he's getting +1 to wound, jumps up to about 9. He's not doing a ton, but that's not really the reason you're bringing him. It's for all the other reasons I kind of mentioned. And then something else that's worth considering anytime you're looking at these 1-2 punch units is, do they hit hard enough to make up for their points value of what you could have taken with the unit that they are helping punch. So you could do, I'll probably do a video of this someday if I get around to it, but it's definitely an idea I've had spinning in my head, which is where you say, take this unit, Let's say you picked a unit where he's adding like a +1 to hit or +1 to wound when he fights first and they fight after. Kind of like the Ogroid Myrmidon with the Ogroid Theridons. What you could do is take in the output calculation of what that, say, Myrmidon is doing, and then calculate how much output a unit of Theridons is doing, given that he just gave them that buff. And that they're all kind of fighting as one big unit together, right? Because it's a 1-2 punch thing. Then you do that compared to what it would be if you took his points value, so the Myrmidon's points value worth of extra dudes. You can even do fractional points just to be right on the dot with it. So say that he cost the same as like 1.5 or something Theridons. He's actually, I think, a bit more than that. But in any case, then you would add that many Theridons, but then you wouldn't add the ability, his output, of course, but also his +1 to hit or wound, whichever he was giving, into the equation. And you could do a comparison. And then, of course, you have a good mathematical comparison, but there's also the less tangible, less quantitative kind of things to take into account, like being the enhancement caddy, making your battle traits work, keeping your drops low if he's an italics hero, all those things that I already mentioned. Anyway, I'm going into this at length partly because we're about to talk about almost the exact same thing with Arch-Kavalos Zandtos, so we can just kind of do our own little meta 1-2 punch with those two units there. But also because this is kind of covering a lot of basics that we're going to talk about throughout the video anyway. I gave him 3 stars because even though I actually personally rank him at a 4-star for myself, I think 3 stars is a more reasonable score for kind of like what the rest of the players out there would be looking for. I wouldn't say that he's great in most situations. I think it depends on what your list is and how hungry you are or how much room you have for that extra hero in your list. If you take, for example, Catacross, and then, like I've complained about Catacross, you have to bring a wizard to kind of make your list do the other stuff it wants to do. Then you're paying a tax to get the wizard, and Catacross is more expensive than, say, Archon. Then I really don't think you're paying yet even more points to get a Liege-Kavalos in the list when you could just be taking, like I was just referring to, his weight in Kavalos Deathriders. He's 210 points. That's 5 Kavalos Deathriders worth, plus 10 points extra. So I just don't think you're bringing him. But it depends on the list. So 3 stars. Let me know what you guys think down below. Okay, on to Arch-Kavalos Zandtos. For 20 points more, you basically get all the same stuff, but he's got +1 health characteristic, so 8 instead of 7, and he's got +1 rend on the rider's profile. The horse is the same. So that's all that you're getting in terms of output difference. He's got the same 2 charge abilities, but he trades out the 1-2 punch ability and the ability to take enhancements for obviously those stats improvements and 20 points, of course. But he gets this once per battle ability to generate a 12-inch Holy Then bubble where any non-hero OBR units, and implicitly not their companions, are getting +1 attack in that combat phase. So it's like pulling the trigger once per game to be able to generate that bubble. And it's very similar to Volturnos' bubble, actually. Yeah, he's like functionally kind of like the OBR Volturnos. That ability, as I mentioned in my last point there, is best on Deathriders and Morghast, but maybe Mortek Guard in a pinch. So the way that you kind of do the math on this is you take however many attacks that you normally have per model in a unit, and then the amount of increased output, percentage-wise, is going to be how much one attack was relative to that original amount. So on Deathriders, the Rider's the only one's getting used that because it doesn't say it's for companion weapons. So that's usually 3 attacks. So you're adding 33% output for that 1 turn. Great. And by the way, his ability doesn't affect himself because he is a hero and it says non-hero. For a Morghast unit, same story. They've got 3 attacks, so you're doing a 33% improvement. For Immortis Guard, also 3 attacks. For Necropolis Stalkers, 4, so less of an improvement, a 25% improvement. But Mortek Guard have 2 attacks built in, so that means you're doing a 50% improvement. The problem is their attacks aren't necessarily, what you want to be spending this on. But that said, you don't have to choose which units get to, use it, except that they just have to be wholly then 12 of him at the time you try to use it. So you could get a whole bunch of stuff going off at once and really increasing your output. But granted, the output that a Mortec Guard, adding 50% to a Mortec Guard, say with, they're hitting on 3s and 4s at -1 only if they got charged, if I'm not mistaken, and then 1 damage, might not actually be as worth it as putting it on, say, our most efficient unit, Kavalos Deathriders. I do think this guy's good. The problem is, I was already complaining about whether a lot of lists are going to be able to fit in a Liege-Kavalos for 210 points for what he brings. And even though this ability is great and is more flexible and is not bound to Kavalos Deathriders per se, you lose the enhancement caddy thing. You lose the 1-2 punch, which is something. It is only a once per battle ability. At least it automatically goes off. I don't know. I think as much as I kind of like the dude, I struggle a little bit with how elite the army is, with how many points he costs. And if I had to pick between him and Volturnos, I would go with Volturnos every day, because I think Volturnos' flexibility and what he brings to an Idoneth army is much more needed than what Arch-Kavalos Zandtos brings to an OBR army relative to the other options you could be spending those points on. So I'm going to put him at 2 stars. I don't think he's has best to avoid. I just think maybe you build a list around using that ability with some really great hammers, or you try some stuff out. I think there could be some value there, but I don't know. I think I like a Liege-Kavalos a bit better. Okay, so on to, the output. The output's basically the same. He, like I said, the only thing that makes him better is he's got +1 rend, and which just basically means that all of the profiles where that extra rend makes a difference. So like he has identical profile on against a 6-up save, right? Because the other guy already had -1 rend, so they're both going there, and then to no save for that unit that they're fighting against. But on a 5-up save, the regular Liege-Kavalos is pushing it to a 6, but then Arch-Kavalos Zandtos is pushing it to no save. So from a 5-up save and better on, you end up seeing a slight improvement. But, it's just making their save worse, which is, fine. But I don't know if the output's enough to really write home about. But here it is on screen if you care to see it. Okay, moving on to the real stars of the show, the Kavalos Deathriders. I don't think anyone would argue with me that they're a 5-star unit for the army. Again, when we're talking about the stars, we're not comparing it to other armies, so external balance. We're talking about internal balance. And in short, my first point is kind of like the best summary. They're just the most efficient unit in OBR. They are, on paper, not as good as you would think, but with all the buffs that are available to OBR, with the relentless discipline abilities, crits on 5s instead of 6s, then the amounts of ways you can kind of worsen someone's save or improve the rend functionally of this unit, getting different units out, or making their wards turn off or get worse, I should say, with the endless spell. There's all kinds of little things you can stack onto these guys that makes a big block of 10 guys, which is 30 wounds on looks like a 4-up save, but if you've got Catacross in the list, you might be getting +1 to save and then an all-out defense, pushing you up to a 3-up save, ignoring 1 point of rend. And then with a 5-up ward, likely, if they're standing in the right bubble, they hit pretty hard, like a lot of cavalry on the charge. They're not all that different, but you put crit 5s on them, they're getting some work out there. They take a good +1 to wound if you don't want to put the 5-up ward on them in the combat phase and would rather put a +1 to wound. Obviously, if they happen to get charged, they're not getting their charge bonus, but that makes up for it a little bit with some anti-charge extra rend. That's another way to get some more rend on there. So anyway, they're just a really solid unit. It's kind of one of the bread and butter units of AOS right now, is this type of cavalry unit, and OBR knows how to do it about as good as anyone else does, for different reasons. I've played a lot of Deathriders, and they do die, and you can screw it up. And if they get stuck in combat, just like any unit that gets doubly as good, almost doubly as good when they charge, if you screw that up and your opponent times them out and they can't get out of combat and get back in, then maybe you're in trouble. But we also have a relentless discipline ability for retreat and charge. They take damage on the way out, but they're still more likely to keep getting that good charge off every single turn, which is pretty great. So my points here, the most efficient in OBR, solid movement at 10 inches, but +2 puts them at 12, maybe +1 to charge with relentless discipline. They've got solid movement, solid defense, as I already mentioned, and they punch pretty hard. They're probably the best recipient for OBR buffs, but maybe there's some other units that would be in the conversation. And I've also, for basically everything we're looking at today, which is more or less the hammers that we have that aren't heroes, or arguably just the hammers, except for maybe the Mortec Crawler, we're going to see all the same buffs more or less stacked on these guys. So we'll get a good comparison. I already mentioned on the lieges that they can charge through infantry. My last point here is unfortunately too good for internal balance. And I do see that as their only real downside, which is that it just throws the whole index off, in my opinion. They went up some points, but honestly, I don't think that's enough to really shake them as being still the best thing. I mean, Immortis Guard costs the same thing for 3 models that are way slower and only a little bit more tanky, I guess. Well, they're actually with a 3-up save and 4 health, they're more tanky, but you know, this is the type of unit that works as both a hammer and an anvil and a tar pit sometimes. And I don't know if I would say that as much about even a reinforced unit of Immortis Guard. But anyway, this unit is still just super strong. And by the way, they can be taken by all heroes except non-unique Mortisans, as in the 4 that I mentioned earlier. Falkmortian, the unique Mortisan, can in fact take them. Okay, so let's look at their output. So like I've done in all these videos thus far, I've got up top, I've got their output scaled for something that makes sense in the video. In this case, it's scaled for themselves when they're on the charge. So this is their not on the charge. Well, actually, okay, I'll take that back. I do have the charge in here, but this is just kind of their base type, the things that they're non-external buffs. I'm sorry, non-external. So meaning none of the buffs that are coming from other sources. This is what you get on the war scroll. Basically not on the charge, with the charge, and then with the impact. The next slide is going to show us why the scale goes all the way up to 28, is because when you stack all the buffs on one of these units, it goes pretty nuts. Down below, though, what we're going to see here is Kavalos on this base profile, and then Kavalos again down on the bottom with their charge, which I summarized as +1 damage. And then Stalkers and Immortis Guard at the level that I'm looking at it here actually have the same exact output as each other, and then the Morghast units, which also are identical in terms of output. What we're looking at in this bottom chart is their damage per 100 points that you spent on them, and then I kept them roughly in the order of increasing strength. In the change column, what you'll see there is if it says not any that are not applicable, either way you want to read that, that's for the unit at hand that we're going to be using as our reference unit, and then how much better or worse they are than the other units. This is without applying any buffs to them. This is just their kind of like regular profiles without using all attack or all the other things, because usually you can't stack them. So we're just looking at the kind of basic profile. But it does give you a sense for how much damage they're doing, not gross damage, as in just how much you get regardless of how many points you put in, but it is taking the points into account, and that gives you another idea for how efficient they are. But anyway, if we look at the main chart up top, let's start there. Not on the charge, we're not that impressed. A unit of 5 is doing something like 4 3/4 damage, or sorry, 5 3/4 damage, probably 5.5, against all saves averaged out. Not really that impressive. On the charge, that gets quite a bit more. We're going up to, what is that, about 10. And then at if they happen to go in and do some impact hits against the infantry units, then they're getting up to just shy of 12 or so. If we look down below, this is the weakest of all the units we'll be looking at today, which is the Kavalos Deathriders when they get stuck in combat and they don't get their charge bonuses off. They are only doing 2 3/4 or so damage per 100 points. And then comparatively, they're 20% worse than Stalkers or Immortis Guard. They're 33% worse than Morghast, both Morghast units. And they're 80% worse than themselves when they're charging. So functionally, we're looking at the blue bar here, comparing it to the orange bar, if that makes sense. The reason why it's not doubly as good, even though it doubles the damage of the rider, is that it doesn't double the damage of the mount. So the mount's damage stays the same, which means the charge doesn't double both profiles. Okay, now let's look at the actual real stuff you want to see here. So this is where it does get up to about 28. From left to right, we're looking at charge base here is literally the same as what we had charge on the last the last chart there, if I'm not mistaken. Let's take a look. Yeah. So the orange that's in this one is the same as the blue in this one. It's just how Excel spreads those out. But anyway, then the next buff, and I kind of rank them from more or less weakest to strongest. So it's assuming we're charging, and then +1 rend. How are they going to get +1 rend? They're not getting it in the anti-charge sense because, of course, they had to have charged. The way that I'm really thinking of that is more that they got -1 save on a unit via Drain Vitality, the spell, or you could have like a Purple Sun out or something like that. But I just thought I'd throw it in because some of the other units can get +1 rend in other easy ways. And so obviously not the anti-charge. That's not how you're getting it. But if they did get it, it typically is one of the less impressive buffs. The green one is getting crit 5s instead of crit 6s, so they have exploding 6s on the riders, but that makes it exploding 5s, so it's twice as likely to go off. That's in the green. Then in the light blue, we've got +1 to wound. That would be from using the +1 to wound choice instead of the 5-up ward in the combat phase for Relentless Discipline. And then what I did is, the reason it jumps so much is because I didn't want to do all possible combinations. I just said, screw it. If you are doing probably 2 or more of these, you're probably throwing an all-out attack on there. So let's just look what happens when you get all those off. So a +1 rend, crit 5s, and +1 to wound. Some are easier to get off than others. And then you say, screw it, I'm going to throw an all-out attack in there to get +1 to hit. And that, of course, does impact the mounts. And that throws them over into the stratosphere, meaning we're getting a... against average save, you're getting something just under, 22 damage just with 5 of these dudes. And obviously you're probably taking them in a block of 10, so it almost doubles. Obviously you don't get a second champion, so, But anyway, they can clear out some units. Granted, you might not get all these buffs out. So just what I would suggest, if you don't know how to do the math on your own at home or whatever with Stats Hammer or something, just assume that those buffs stack a bit, and so on the way to getting to that extreme value in kind of like the fuchsia or whatever that is. So when they are on the charge, looking at the charge chart down below, they have the best output of all the groups that we're looking at today, and by quite a bit. Against themselves, they're about 4, when they're just on their base, they're at, and this is not looking at with all the buffs possible. This is just looking at them on the charge base. So that's just the dark blue here. We're not looking at the fuchsia. So that's 44% better than what they would be if they weren't charging. 33% better than Stalkers or Immortis Guard. 26% better than both Morghast units. And of course, the same with themselves. So anyway, they're a 5-star unit. Until they nerf them in some way, I don't really see that changing. Or until they change the internal balance and buff some of the other units, perhaps. Okay, so we're done with the cavalry. Let's go on to the not actually cavalry because they have the infantry keyword, but functionally do a cavalry roll because they're just as fast as the other ones. In fact, this unit right here, Morghast Harbingers, are even faster because they have a 3d6 charge, which is that passive orange ability right there. So this unit can be taken by all heroes. Why? Because what changed here between them and the Kavalos Deathriders? It's that because they have the infantry keyword, all the Mortisan heroes, which were the only ones that couldn't take the cavalry, can implicitly take infantry. So by how they're described. So basically, this unit, there's no collection of heroes you're going to have that is going to limit how many Morghast or Immortis Guard or Necropolis Stalkers you bring because they're all infantry. So if you want some cavalry speed dudes, but don't want to have to bring one of your guys that enables that, you just want to bring non-unique Mortisans, then this is an option. They do cost 270 points for 2, which is probably my biggest problem with this unit, but we'll talk about that in a second. They have 6 health, 4-up save, 10-inch move, like I said, control 2, 6+ ward can go to 5+ in the combat phase. I mentioned the charge ability, which is 3d6 charge. They also have a once per turn army reaction to declaring a Relentless Discipline ability that even if they're not within range of the hero that used it, they get to use it. So one unit once per turn, not per battle round, once per turn, so twice per battle round, gets to use one of your Relentless Discipline abilities remotely. So you basically combine these two abilities. These are great kind of scouting units. I wouldn't really call them chaff or objective, sitters, because you're putting too many points into them for just two dudes that can die really easily. But they also hit really hard, relatively speaking. I don't know if they actually hit hard for their points. We'll talk about that in a bit. But you'll see their profile there is 3 attacks, 3s to hit, 2s to wound, -2 rend, 3 damage. Against monsters, the rend goes up to 3. And like pretty much all OBR non-companions, they have exploding 6s. And they have the exact same output profile as their kin in the Morghast Archai, which we'll talk about just after this. So we're actually going to skip talking about their output until we've covered both of the differences between the units. So I said that this is the potentially least efficient unit in OBR. If efficiency is not just about your output, but is also about your survivability, and the thing is, 6 wounds of these dudes is like losing 2 Kavalos Deathriders, right? And the output may or may not be somewhat close to that, but every time you lose 6 wounds on these guys with a 4-up save, you're really hurting. And these guys kind of want to go out into the middle of nowhere and go, maybe steal some objectives. Keep in mind, we don't really have a lot of fast units that we can just throw away to go off in the corners, except maybe Tyrannic Cohort. And so even if you did take 2 units to go out and do 2 separate missions, only one of them are using that ability. The 3d6 charge does allow them to kind of get back to the center of your Relentless Discipline bubbles, but in my experience, and I've played a few games with these guys, they just die to a swift breeze. And I know it looks like you're like, oh, well, you get a unit of equivalent of 4 out of 5 Kavalos Deathriders. So what's the problem? Well, in terms of how tanky they are. Well, I mean, it's only 4 out of 5, but you're paying 270 points instead of 200. So not only are you getting 80% of the value, but you're paying, 70 points more, which is 35% more of the cost. It just doesn't balance out. And even though the output might be a little bit better on the charge, as we already saw on the chart that I just showed you, and we'll look at again from this perspective, they're not putting out as much as the Kavalos Deathriders on the charge. And so they do have a function. That's why I gave them 2 stars. Let's look at maybe my notes, and then we'll wrap that up. They want to be elite scouts with remote, relentless discipline and 3d6 charge to make it back to the army, as I mentioned, but their output doesn't make up for their weak save and toughness, whatever you want to call it, their health. And they need to, in my opinion, to make them actually get back up to 3 stars or higher, they need to be significantly cheaper and or get a 3-up save. The Archai, then, which we'll look at shortly, would then see, because they have a built-in 3-up save, you'd be like, well, now what's separating them? Because let's say you didn't change the price, but you made these guys a 3-up save. And they do kind of look like they'd have a 3-up save. They're big old chunky boys, both of the units. I think maybe you would bump Archai up to a 2-up save, but we'll talk about that in a second. But otherwise, I actually think this unit could come down. Like if we're going to look at foreshadowing for Necropolis Stalkers, but that unit also had an efficiency problem for what you were paying, and they keep bringing their costs down, which is good. I think this unit should probably be closer to 200. They're kind of like a bad version of like the Dracothian Guard from Stormcast, like Fulminators, because those come in 2s as well. They have 1 extra health, but a -1 save, which makes a huge difference. I'd rather have 5 health on these guys than a 3-up save, personally. They're the same speed. I think they have less output, or at least can have less output, depending on the circumstances. I don't know. You're just putting a lot of points in something that's just going to die, and I can't seem to keep them alive. And getting all the right buffs on them, they want to be able to get, buffs from, say, an Ossifictor or from, wizards trying to put crits on 5s on them, but they're usually off out in the middle of nowhere if they're doing their thing, being aggressive with their charging and being able to get back and everything and use the abilities from afar, that sometimes you're just not able to make them the optimized version that they need to be. And when you could have just been doing 200 points worth of 5 Kavalos Deathriders and having 70 points left over for something else. Anyway. So I gave them 2 stars. Let's look at the Archai. I've already kind of touched up on a lot of these things. They have a lot of overlap. Everything on their war scroll is the same except for their abilities, which are basically something you're easily going to forget. Basically, it's got a ward against spell and prayer abilities and abilities used by manifestation. So, but that's only against, well, no, that is damage points, so it doesn't have to be mortal damage. So that's actually good. If they get into combat with a manifestation, that their to fight abilities count as abilities and therefore would give them a ward, which is good. Now, they have a built-in 6-up ward, and the second part of that rule says if you make a successful ward roll for this unit, not a successful ward roll with the 3+ ward, but with any ward, or if this unit destroys an enemy manifestation, give this unit an arcane charge token. So there's all this wording to give them 1 arcane charge token. They can never have more than 1. So basically, anytime someone's shooting at them, they're probably going to ward off something somewhere, and then they'll have an arcane charge token on them. And then in any hero phase, so including your opponents, if you try to do a magical intervention, they can choose a wizard to blow that token as long as that wizard's holier than 12, and then gives +1 to casting rolls, which is great in, say, Mortis and Council, so you can get someone up to +2 to cast, or even +3 with like an Place of Power. Or, of course, Archon has a built-in +1 as well. Nagash you could even give it to, which is pretty cool. But at the end of the day, honestly, I think this rule is complicated enough and kind of not the main thing you're thinking about when you're thinking about using this unit that you might actually forget to use it. So anyway, my points here are the +1 save they have and their output and the way that you want to use them. Because they don't have the 3d6 charge, which feels like it goes to waste if you were to just keep them nearby all of your castle stuff. Because they don't have that Relentless Discipline remote use ability, you're probably going to keep them close by. And that means they're getting all of the great buffs, especially in a Katakros list where he's giving them +1 to save, which is pushing them up to 2+ save, and then maybe ignoring a point of rend and keeping the 2+ if you use all at defense. It makes them the second best hammer after Deathriders, combined with their save stuff. It means they actually survive long enough to be a hammer, which maybe is kind of my point here. But my second point, they do need to be babysat by Katakros and a wizard for exploding 5s. I really feel like the exploding 5s help make this unit, go above and beyond instead of exploding 6s. An Ossiarch in the list can give +1 rend. And he can do it for the other guys, but they have to. It's on a 3-up. It's only once per battle or once per turn army, so you're not stacking it. The Ossiarch can't keep up with those harbingers that are going out, and they have to be holier than 12 of him anyway. And on a 3-up, he gives this unit or Gothazar Harvester, if I'm not mistaken, +1 rend, which can be really great on these guys because you do not want any of those. Them making any of their saves against this unit because they have so few attacks. They have the same number of attacks, each one of these guys that cost 135 points, has the same number of attacks as just the rider of a Kavalos Deathrider or of an Immortis Guard. So you need to make sure those attacks do what they need with that 3 damage. So you need to make sure that Rend's getting up there. Sometimes Rend 2 is not enough to cut it. If someone's got a 3-up save, then they use an all-out defense. They go up to 2, and you're -2, and then they go to 4, which means half of your stuff's not going through, which really can reduce their efficiency and can be pretty soul-crushing if you spend all these points, 540 points on 4 of these dudes, and then half of the damage ends up going out. So you really need to get that extra rend. Their +1 to cast buff, as I said, is fine, but easy to forget. I said that this unit might need to be cheaper to be internally balanced against the Deathriders. That said, I do think there are people that are using a big block of 4 of these guys sticking around Katakros, kind of being that threat piece, okay, come at me, bro, that kind of thing. Meanwhile, you send some Deathriders out or whatever. I think there's definitely someone's out there is probably going to say 270 is totally fine. I'm okay with that, but if you do that, I would like to see them get a better save. Or something else change about their profile. I don't know what it would have to be, but the +1 save is largely coming from the fact that I think the Harbingers need to go up to 3 up, and then you need something to separate the Archai from the Harbingers. Maybe if you just make their attack profiles different, and you give these guys 4 attacks, or built-in 3 rend. I don't know, something crazy. Anyway, that's my thoughts on the Archai. Let's move, and I'm calling them a 3-star unit, by the way, because I think there are plenty of lists that can use them, but I don't think it's necessarily a almost good in every list kind of thing. But I do think they can do some really great work. So this is the output for the Morghast versus a non-monster because they get +1 rend. And so if I just scroll between these two, you'll see that only thing that changes is that the extra rend changes the output since they have a base -2 rend or whatever, that the 6s and 5s don't change at all, but then the 4s, 3s, 2s, and of course the expected value average all jump up. Here's a case where I think you'll notice that because they have a built-in -2 rend, the 4-up save is not comparable to the expected value average. So they're actually doing better against the 4-up save than on their average scores. So that's one of the reasons why I like to use expected value averages. Depending on what someone's rend's like, the relationship's not always going to be the same. But anyway, what I took into account here was their base, so getting no buffs. Again, this is not against a monster. So getting +1 rend, now that could be from it being charged, because a lot of times they won't be doing the charging themselves. Getting charged, so they could get that Relentless Discipline ability. It could be the Purple Sun. It could be Drain Vitality via -1 save. It could be the Ossiarch's ability. So they've got a bit more of a reason to think you could get their +1 rend. Crit 5s work really great on them. And then getting both of those abilities with all-out attacks, say you want to just throw everything in the kitchen sink at them, then you're getting up to that last thing. But you'll notice a unit of 2 of these guys is getting nowhere near the range that we got to with the Deathriders with absolutely everything. If we go back to the Deathriders real quick, I'm just going to scroll back for a second. Sorry for the automations here. But if we ignore that total one, then what we're looking at is if we look at expected value average, again, these charts are all scaled. So 5 Kavalos Deathriders, this is assuming we're on the charge. Let's say we did the best one, the best single buff, which would be +1 to wound. That's coming out to like about 13 damage. And then if we look at, we're going back to the Archai, their best one without stacking everything would be the green one, and that's at about 12. But remember, this unit costs 70 points more. And yeah, I don't know. Let's look at their points, the damage per 100 points, and I think we can make the point even better. So they're going to be our third option here, a third row, third best. They're about 10% better than Stalkers and Immortis Guard when they're just on their base profile. And then 25% better than Kavalos at their base profile, so not charging. But they're about 35% worse efficiency-wise against Kavalos on the charge. So that's kind of the point right there, is are they doing enough to make up for what Kavalos could be doing? And I don't know. They are tankier, in a sense. I mean, a unit for 270 points, you're getting 12 wounds on a 3-up save. I actually did the math on this. It doesn't actually come out to tankier in the long run. They still have to put more damage through on the Deathriders, because that's block of 5 is 15 wounds on a 4-up save. There might have been like a setting of rend that was better, that the Archai were better at than the Deathriders, like -3. But other than that, I think they came out better. So anyway, and then here's looking at them versus a monster. Like I said, it's just giving another point of rend, so that puts them on to rend 3 or rend 4 if they get the +1 rend from somewhere else as well. And then you see what the percentages are down below. So only 20% worse than Kavalos on the charge if they're going up against monsters. So, you know, it's kind of cool. And it's worth noting, the other units don't get a buff against monsters. If they did, I would have compared them to their output against monsters, so they would be fair. Okay. So anyway, on to the last 2 units. These are kind of like I like to call Kurnoth level units, because they don't fly. They're maybe, 1 health less than Kurnoth's. I guess their save is worse too. But they're on, I think, the same bases, kind of the same profile. about the same speed. We're going to start with Necropolis Stalkers. The idea and the lore is that these guys have like 4 heads, and kind of like your terrain piece, the heads, I guess, rotate to be like the dominant head that's leading the charge or whatever, and that's where you get their combat phase ability that's choosing one of 4 different aspects, which are basically associated with each one of the heads. So this unit is designed to be modular. Okay, you're getting 3 of them for 160 points. That points drop has made a significant difference in my opinion of this unit, and I still think I'm a little on the fence, but we'll talk about it in a second. 4 health, 4 up save, 6 up ward. They move a little faster than the other guys. They're 6 inch move instead of 5 than their kin in the Immortis Guard. Their profile is different. Unlike the Morghast, 2 Morghast units, their profile is different. They have 1 more attack. And 1 better rend, but half as much damage. And that's really where the problem kicks in. We'll talk about their output shortly. Now, if we go to the combat phase abilities, every single combat phase you get to pick one of these effects. One is subtract 3 from control scores of enemy units while they're in combat. Okay, I don't know how often you're choosing that, but if that's going to make a difference of assuming you survive, again, they're a little paper thin, they're easier to kill, but assuming they survive, maybe it'll, sway the balance of who's standing on objectives to help you win an objective. That could be something. We get the second one, which is -1 to hit for combat attacks that target this unit. Important that they're not just subtracting -1 to hit like the Soul Reaper does. If you're in combat with him, he's -1 to wound. Against no matter if any unit is standing within 3 inches of him, they have -1 to wound. This is just saying if they choose to target him, these units, the Stalkers. So it's kind of a defensive ability, it's kind of helping out with the fact that they've got a bad save. I do see a 4-up save on an elite unit as a bad save, by the way. The third is probably the best one. They turn off ward rolls for damage points inflicted by this unit's combat attacks. Now keep in mind, a unit of 3 of these guys is max going to do 12 damage. And I hate talking about that because that's not a realistic expectation. Technically, that's not true. You have crit 2 hits. You got exploding hits. There is a possibility, but let's take that out of the equation for a second and just look at it what its mathematical equivalent would be. That it's like adding +1 to hit. So realistically, you're looking at 12 attacks with hitting on 2s because of the crit 2 hits, 3s, -2 rend, but only 1 damage. And turning off ward rolls is really good, but that unit of 3 is not doing as much damage as you might think. Functionally, that damage profile is the same as like Morghast Guard. It's just like they have double the amount of attacks, each one of these guys. Yes, a better to wound roll and significantly better rend, but they're kind of like fancy a Morghast Guard in a sense. If you take 3 of them, you're basically getting the equivalent of 6 Morghast Guard with some buffs. And you're turning off ward rolls, which means if you need to snipe a hero or really just, kind of get those last few in, that's pretty cool. I don't know if it's going to make their points worth it, but we'll get to that in a sec. And the last one is this unit's melee weapons have anti-hero +1 rend. Now here's the thing, is like turning off ward rolls, I usually think about turning off ward rolls for heroes. So then you're choosing between these 2 abilities if that's the case. Would I rather have extra rend or turn off their ward? And I think it really depends on what their save and ward is. If they're a normal death unit that has a 6-up ward, I would probably go for the extra rend unless their save is really bad, because I'm not that bothered by a 6-up ward. But if it's like Nurgle or better, and they're like a 5-up or maybe even a 4-up ward, turning it all the way off does way more work than adding +1 rend, generally speaking. And they're already at a decent rend of 2. So I actually think there are some uses for these abilities, and I like that you can change it every single turn. There's always a good one that you could be doing. You can at least be doing subtract 1 from hit rolls, and that's always going to do something. So anyway, looking at their notes, I said their role in OBR is not 100% clear, but the point discounts have helped. They used to be, I want to say 180, maybe even closer to the 200 point mark. I can't remember what they originally came out as, but I think most recently they were 180. Coming down to 160 is starting to get to a point where I'm interested. Because you could write a list that's like an elite Catacross type build where you take blocks of 6 of these guys and have them kind of stay within his 18-inch bubble, and have them always walking around with a +1 save, so they're looking at a 3-up. It's kind of helping you get there. Obviously, they can never get better than a 3-up. It's not like a 3-up that can go to a 2-up, and that does make a difference. But I think there's some amount of something that can make them work. I really think that 1 damage is the thing that really throws me on this unit. But now that we're getting down to kind of a reasonable points value, I could see it maybe being a thing. I mentioned here that +1 inch move, but -1 save from Immortis is basically the big difference, and then of course the ability. I already talked about the modular ability. I said the most popular probably turning off wards or the -1 to hit. I feel like it's just kind of hard to justify their cost versus other options. When you could be looking at 5 Deathriders for only 40 points more, I just don't know. I could see Deathriders continuing to go up to 220 or something, but personally, I'd rather see some other units just get buffed or cheaper, and let Deathriders feel like a reasonable choice in the army, but not the obvious one. Let's look at the Stalkers output. So again, this is scaled for Deathriders on the charge, with a max amount that they could be putting out. So we've got the same things here. We've got their base profile, +1 rend via many of the sources I've already mentioned, crit 5s, +1 to wound via the relentless discipline, and then using everything with all attacks. So even when they're throwing everything in the kitchen sink, a unit of 3 of these dudes is only getting to about 10.5, which is really disappointing in my kind of personal opinion. We were looking at more than double that for only 40 points more in a unit of 5 Deathriders on the charge. So it's kind of, maybe they're more of a scalpel unit for taking some things out. But as you see here, they're in the chart below, they're about 17% better than Kavalos not on the charge. They're 11%, they're the same as Immortis Guard, at least on their base profile. They have slight differences depending on which buffs they get off, but generally speaking, they follow roughly the same trajectory as you throw the buffs on, per 100 points, I should say. They're 11% worse than a Morghast unit in terms of efficiency, which is saying something because I really feel like the Morghasts have a problem. And then Kavalos on the charge, they're 50%, they're half as good, which is pretty crazy. But they could choose to take the aspect that goes into heroes. And I should also note here that none of my calculations that I ever show on this channel thus far have taken into account ward saves, because there are so few armies that have meaningful ward saves. Yes, all of Death has a 6-up, a lot of demons have 6-up, but to me, I'm not that worried about a 6-up ward. It saves a thing or two here or there, but generally speaking, it's not ruining my day. And the amount of units that have a 5-up or better is mostly on heroes. It's kind of limited, and calculating in how much of an impact that would have would mean that I'd have to throw a whole other dimension in here that's not against just your save, but also coupling those saves with different wards, or just make more options in a row there, like say a 6-up with a 6-up, a 5-up with a 6-up, a 4-up with a 6-up, and then throw way more options in there, and it just gets unwieldy. So I don't usually talk about it, but I will say obviously their output gets better than Immortis Guard if they're going into a unit with a ward save that's especially a strong ward save. So keep that in mind. I didn't take that into account. But if we look at against their output against a hero, they get +1 rend. And so then we're looking at the big change here is that against on their own row, instead of saying not any, I went for in parentheses +11%. That's basically like saying against what they would be if they chose to do, say, one of the other abilities, their modular abilities against themselves, or against Immortis Guard. Just with their normal base abilities. So they're 11% better. 1% better than Morghast if they're going into heroes, which is kind of interesting in terms of efficiency. They're basically 1% is within a margin of error, right? So that's basically the same. And then -33% against Kavalos Deathriders on the charge. Oh, and one last thing about Necropolis Stalkers, about their star rating. If they hadn't gotten the points discount, I probably would have given them a 2, maybe even a 1 before. I just couldn't be sold on that, but I did play against a French player not too long ago that was swearing by the value of Necropolis Stalkers as a tech piece to add into an army. And that was at I think 2 points values ago, maybe only 1 points value ago. I can't remember if they changed once or twice, at least once. But anyway, if someone wants to convince me that they're better than 3 or that they definitely deserve a 3 instead of a 2, I was kind of teetering between a 2 or 3 here. So let me know what you think. All right, so moving on to Immortis Guard. So basically, they have a similar kind of look, obviously, and points value and kind of thing. There's 3 for 200 instead of 160. They used to be closer together. They can be taken by all heroes, just like the other units we've talked about. They've got the same move, health, control, score, all the other stuff, but they have +1 save. -1 move. That's different than the Necropolis Stalkers. So they're a little slower, but much tankier. That difference is huge, in my opinion. And their output, they have 1 less attack, 1 less rend, but +1 damage, which is double the amount of output. And then you compensate for those other things. So obviously, like if you lose 1 attack and you had 4 attacks, you're losing 25% of your output, but then you got 50% more output, or double output. So those things balance out to still be a net positive. And then, of course, the rend is dependent on what your target is. Now, they don't have the modular ability, so they don't have any way to kind of like get better in combat other than the normal buffs that OBR has access to. But what they do have is the main reason you take them, is that they give +1 to the ward rolls for friendly OBR heroes within its combat range. But if you happen to make an unmodified ward roll of 1 for one of those heroes, then you have to allocate 1 damage point to this unit after the damage sequence to the hero, and then you can't make ward rolls for it. So you take extra damage on these guys. But that's not that bad. Sometimes you see this kind of rule, and it says if they fail the ward roll, then this unit has to take it. I think Bellicor has that in the new Legion of the First Prince with demon units nearby. But this is just if you roll 1s. Now, of course, that can kill off your Immortis Guard, but adding +1 to ward rolls means all of your base 6 wards go up to 5s, which means even though you can get a 5 easily in the combat phase, this means that it's 5 even in like against spells in the hero phase, even against shooting, whatever other charge phase type, impact hit type things you could have. So you're getting a 5-up ward. Or if they're at a 5-up in the combat phase, then it goes up to a 4-up. Nagash is at a permanent 5-up, so that puts him to a 4-up, which makes them really great for him. And then Katakros and Archon are only at 6s, but then in the combat phase could easily get up to 4s with the 2 different sources of +1 ward functionally. So these guys are really great. Now, they don't get to use that ward for themselves. They're on a 6-up ward. And they of course would be on a 5-up in the combat phase, but if they've got that relentless discipline going. But anyway, so I described them as tanky bodyguard unit for your heroes. They've got a +1 ward, so going a 6 going to 5 or a 5 going to 4 is what you'll see in OBR for heroes, but they take damage on unmodified 1s. As I mentioned, -1 move compared to Necropolis Stalkers, but +1 save. They're probably an auto take with Katakros, so like a 5-star unit, and maybe Mortisans in a castle, keeping those little like very easy to kill little guys safe. And they actually have pretty decent output. This is kind of like a Stormcast type profile with 3 attacks, 2 damage, that kind of stuff. And then the crits help, get some more swinginess in there. So let's take a look at their output. It's very similar to the Necropolis Stalkers, except, and of course you're paying more points for these guys, but I think the main reason I rank them higher is that they stay alive long enough to actually hit back, and they're helping your hero stay alive. They've got a really important role. And so you're looking at, with all the buffs stacked against expected value average, they're looking at 14 for a unit, which is obviously more raw output than what we looked at for the Necropolis Stalkers. I'll go back there. That was when they were getting all their buffs off, they're looking at, 11? So it's a good 3 or so more against all saves averaged out. But of course, you're paying 40 extra points for them. But I just feel like everything else they're bringing to the table kind of balances them out. So against Kavalos on their not charging state, they're 17% better. Against Stalkers, they're the same in terms of per 100 points. Morghast, they're 11% less efficient. And Kavalos Deathriders on the charge, they're 50% less efficient. Similar to Necropolis Stalkers. So they're a 4-star unit. So if we go through the stars real quick of what we've talked about, I started with the Liege-Kavalos, and the Liege was at 3. Then Arch-Kavalos Zandtos was a 2. Then we moved on to the Deathriders. I put at 5. Then we had the Harbingers, which were at 2. Then 3 for the Archai. I could see maybe being a 4, and especially in certain builds. Then Necropolis Stalkers were a 3, but I could honestly see it going down to a 2. And then the Immortis Guard are up to a 4. So we've got everything but a 1 on the list right now. And the Immortis Guard, I feel like really support certain builds. But if you're doing like an Archon plus Deathriders and just going out in the field, obviously you don't take them. And that's kind of one of the reasons I put them at 4, because they're not for every list. Anyway, so that's what we got. I hope you guys enjoyed. The last video I hope to get done within like a week or so. I'm busy with grading papers and reports from students in my data mining course that I'm teaching right now. But anyway, I'll get to it as soon as I can. And we'll be talking about the Mortisans and then the Mortek Guard and Tyrannic cohort. So kind of like the regular ground troops that aren't very elite. I hope you guys have been enjoying it. Let me know in the comments. And thanks for all the positivity in the comments that we got over the last few videos. All right, guys, until next time, Happy New Year, and Ryan out.